Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 37. There was something empty inside him. He couldn't put his finger on what, couldn't figure out the exact shape of it. But something was missing, and it only added to the agonizing cold that constantly threatened to take him over. He didn't know what it was he was missing, but the lack of it hurt more deeply than any memory he had uncovered yet. Focusing on the mission was much easier.
All of our work is gone,
Bruce said, and Tony was pretty sure he'd never heard his friend sound so despondent. And for good reason, too. He'd made leaps and bounds in figuring out how Hydra had enhanced the Maximoff twins, work he might have ultimately been able to use to rid himself of the Hulk. All his files, everything he'd accomplished was gone. Tony found it more difficult to sympathize than he'd like to admit, and yet it was so much easier to think about that than everything else.
Ultron cleared us out, used the internet as an escape hatch.
Ultron, Steve said, and it was sharp and dry and full of accusation that might have made Tony jump up in his face, except Jamie was sleeping with his head in Tony's lap, and God, even remembering those first few panicked moments when he realized a mad artificial intelligence was in the same building as Jamie, and that Tony did not have his eyes on the kid! It still set his heart to racing now, almost an hour later. It's as good a name for him as any, Tony managed. His voice sounded hoarse even to his own ears. Ultron is a protocol we worked on in the months after the Battle of New York. Purely hypothetical. Meant to protect the Earth from extraterrestrial threats. And of course, after the extremist incident, they'd also added parameters for out-of-control metahumans. We didn't think any tech would be advanced enough for it for decades, so we weren't too thorough. If we'd known a Hydra-programmed AI would absorb it, we'd have made sure to specify that protect the Earth means protecting humanity, and that the Avengers aren't a threat. Of course, it would still have that fucked up Hydra worldview to contend with, but... He trailed off, and he was tired. He'd slept perhaps 6 hours in all over the past 3 days, and then the battle, and now... He was exhausted. Steve looked as though there was something he'd like to say. Thankfully, Natasha broke in before he could. He's been in everything. Files, surveillance. Probably knows more about us than we know about each other. Brody looked scared, and that frightened Tony more than anything. He could count on a single hand with fingers to spare the amount of times he'd seen Brody truly scared. He's in your files, he said. He's in the internet. What if he decides to access something a little more exciting? Tony looked down at Mickey, who was laying across his feet, warm and heavy. He let out a slow breath. Nuclear codes, Hill said. Nuclear codes? Rhodey confirmed. Look, we need to make some calls, assuming we still can. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, tapped at it quickly, and raised it to his ear. For a moment, Tony was about to tell him just to get Jarvis to connect it for him, then he remembered. His chest clenched tight, and fuck, he could not deal with this right now. Nukes? Natasha said. He said he wanted us dead. And how was that confusing anyway? Nukes without a convenient portal to send them through were pretty effective ways to kill people, and Tony just wanted to put Jamie in the Iron Cradle and keep him there until all this was over, except he couldn't. He couldn't because Jarvis controlled the cradle, and Jarvis... No, do not go there! He didn't say dead, Steve said. He said extinct. And shit, what were they fucking on about? How was any of this remotely relevant to the situation right now compared to about a million other things they should be discussing? Tony breathed out carefully, smoothing Jamie's hair out of his face. How was the kid even sleeping in this ruckus anyway? He also said he killed somebody? Clint said, sounding almost as exhausted as Tony felt, but also wary, as though he already knew the answer to his unspoken question. But there wasn't anyone else in the building, Hill said, and just like that, Tony couldn't stay quiet any longer. Yes, there was! He spat, and he probably would have been walking around gesticulating, trying to get rid of the kinetic energy that was his own anger, his own frustration, and sorrow that would catch up with him the moment he let it. Instead, he pulled his phone out of his pocket and used it to call up the hologram of Jarvis. You could hardly bear to look at it, this representation of Jarvis's... of his corpse, torn apart and left like some macabre... Tony could not deal with this.
This is insane,
Bruce breathed. His voice was far from steady, and Tony met his eyes for a moment. Out of all the Avengers, Bruce had spent most time in the tower, knew Jarvis the best. Out of all of them, Bruce was probably the only one aside from Tony who thought of Jarvis as an actual person. It was more comforting than Tony would have liked to admit. Steve sighed, and it was the barest bit of balm that he too seemed to care at least a little. Tony determinedly did not try to figure out whether he cared about Jarvis as a person or as a tool. Jarvis was the first line of defense, Steve said. You would have shut Ultron down, it makes sense.
No,
Bruce said, eyes caught on Jarvis's digital remains.
Ultron could have assimilated Jarvis, like he did the Ultron protocol to begin with. He must have used him as a springboard to get off the isolated server, and he clearly had no problem assimilating the protocol and shaping it to suit his purposes. This isn't strategy, this is rage.
And then suddenly Thor was back, and his huge ham hand was wrapping around Tony's neck, lifting him up off the couch and dislodging Jamie as a result. What the fuck? What the actual fuck? Barton was saying something somewhere in the background, but Tony was dangling by his neck. His feet didn't even touch the ground, and it felt like drowning, felt like his head shoved underwater and held there. Come on, use your words, buddy, Tony croaked, but it was more reflex than anything. His heart was pounding way too fast, and he couldn't breathe. Then Mickey was there, growling and barking, and for the first time since he met her, Tony honestly thought she might just have it in her to bite another living creature. Jamie followed right at her heels, small hands tucking into fists and slamming into Thor's solid stomach.
That's my daddy! He was shouting. You're hurting daddy! Let go of him, you great big asshole!
Absently, all too aware of the panic coursing through him and the lack of oxygen in his brain, Tony noted that perhaps he should start thinking about regulating his language around Jamie. Perhaps he should have started thinking about that right about the time he returned from Afghanistan.
Let go!
Jamie screamed, and Thor finally did. Tony collapsed back onto the couch, rubbing at his throat. Tony took a moment to catch his breath, half aware that Thor was now reporting on his failure to catch up with the Legionnaire who had escaped with a scepter, and the general consensus that it had to be put on the back burner because Ultron was more important right now.
I don't understand, Helen Cho was saying. You built this program, why is it trying to kill us?
Part of Tony almost wanted to laugh because damn it all, why was that the conclusion they jumped to? Why the fuck was that what they got out of all this? We did not build this program, he finally said, and if his voice was even hoarser now than before, fuck it. If Thor wound up feeling some kind of guilt, Tony was all for it. It's flattering, really, that you think Bruce and I could actually create a fully functioning murder bot in 3 days. It's nice that there are times when you will acknowledge that we're two of the smartest men in the world, but this is the wrong time. We did not do this. Bruce looked like he was actually fighting about some green. That, too, was not the comforting.
We did exactly what you and Tony agreed we would do, he told Thor. We studied the scepter and scanned it and tried to learn as much about it as we could. We deliberately kept it on a quarantined server. Never once did we even discuss attempting to create an interface.
Jamie was looking back and forth between the adults in the room. He seemed to have calmed down some, but his spine was still too stiff, and he held himself slightly between Thor and Tony. Tony wasn't sure whether that was adorable or heartbreaking. He pulled himself back on his feet, walked the half a step that separated him from his son, and pulled the boy close, felt some of the tension seep out of both their bodies. Here's the thing, Tony said. The AI already existed before we ever took the scepter back. Not sure if it comes from some space entity we don't know anything about, or from Loki, or from Hydra, or S.H.I.E.L.D. But he was already there, and given his background, he was probably never remotely friendly. He broke into the tower mainframe, created his own interface, and got out. Which, yeah, that's rather unfortunate. But here's the thing. Even if Bruce and I had never touched the scepter, we'd still have been dealing with the AI in probably just a few months. The robotics lab under Strucker's creepy castle, the amount of service and sheer processing power they'd accumulated, Hydra was definitely working on an interface. At least this way, we got a chance to learn whatever there was to learn about the scepter beforehand. He didn't bother to reiterate why that was important. Out of all the others, Bruce was really the only one who'd ever taken Tony's extraterrestrial fears seriously. Thor sighed, and why the fuck could he still look like an overgrown puppy dog in a situation like this?
I apologize, my friends,
he said at last.
I was tired, and I was wroth. I reacted poorly, I am sorry.
Inexplicably, Tony felt the faintest bit lighter at those words. It's alright, big guy, he said. It wasn't, but Thor had apologized, and Tony was pretty sure there was nothing in the world more earnest than an apology from Thor, which did help. Just try not to strangle me in front of my son again. That would be nice. And even more, the kick puppy look this time on Jamie.
My deepest apologies, young James,
Thor said.
No child should have to see his father mistreated so.
Jamie shrugged and leaned back into Tony's body. He was probably glaring, and later on he would insist that Maria was telling him people had to earn forgiveness because if you gave it cheaply, it would be taken for granted, or something equally philosophical. Tony once again lamented just how clever Jamie was and how mistrustful life had made him. Rhodey stepped back from where he'd been off with his phone. So far, the nuclear codes are safe. The military is on high alert. POTUS is being informed, as are the other nuclear powers worldwide. He let out a breath. I'll go coordinate with them. Tony nodded and resisted the urge to reach out for a hug before Rhodey left. If he did let himself hug Rhodey, he would probably never let go, would break down in front of the team, in front of Jamie, sobbing for the friend who died, and for the sheer terrifying danger they were all in every second of every day, the danger none of the others would even acknowledge. Ultron's calling us out, Steve said then, and he was using his Inspire the Troops voice more than a bit annoying. Still, it was pretty effective in making everyone shut up and pay attention. And I'd like to find him before he's ready for us. The world's a big place. Let's start making it smaller.